Chief System Integration Officer of ESIG and Senior Director of GE Vernova's Consulting Services. I want to welcome you to our monthly webinar series and give you a little bit of background on ESIG. For those of you not familiar with ESIG, we're a membership-based, nonprofit organization providing our members with objective information, resources, and networking opportunities in support of renewable energy and energy systems integration decisions worldwide. We do this through workshops, tutorials, webinars, blogs, working group and task force activities, and producing technical resource materials. We also serve in a leadership role with the Global Power System Transformation Consortium, or the GPST, whose mission is to bring together key actors to catalyze a rapid clean energy transition at unprecedented scope and speed. ESIG pillar leads the first pillar of 5 pillars, which deals with the research agenda for the founding system operators, and more information on the GPST can be found at www.globalpst.org. We had a great in-person spring technical workshop at the end of March in Tucson, with temperatures a little cooler than normal, and even maybe a little hail at the start of our meeting, but our attendance of over 260 smiling faces and friends kept us warm while we were there. This was our 3rd workshop above pre-pandemic levels, and we continue to be pleased with our growing community. Our next workshop on forecasting and markets will be in Salt Lake City in June 11th, followed by our fall technical workshop in Providence, Rhode Island in October. We really hope to see you there. Our workshops and monthly webinars are open to everyone, so please feel free to register at any time on the ESIG website. If you're new to ESIG, I strongly encourage you to follow up with us if you like what you hear, and I think you will be pleasantly surprised. ESIG membership will give you an opportunity to actively participate in all of our working groups and task forces. You can find us on the web at www.esig.energy, as well as on LinkedIn, on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Okay, before we get started, just a few logistical matters. First of all phones will be muted during the duration of the webinar to avoid unnecessary distractions. For the Q&A, we have moved to the Slido platform, and we're asking you to ask your questions through Slido. Please go to slido.com and enter ESIG25, as you see on your screen here. That's ESIG25 is the Slido token. And the instructions are also at the bottom of the screen. And please give us a thumbs up to vote questions in the order that you would like to see them answered. We plan to save about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A at the end and then wrap up at the end of the hour. An email link will be provided once the video file has been posted. And we also plan to provide short responses to any unanswered questions after the webinar. So please don't be afraid to ask your questions through Slido. So today's webinar will be on the contemporary subject of flexibility from hydrogen. Throughout many of the workshops and working groups discussions that we've had over the past couple decades, we all know that system flexibility is critical at maintaining a reliable power system, especially as our grids decarbonize with high levels of wind and solar generation and electrify consumption. Green hydrogen is one more tool that system planners and operators can consider as grid flexibility needs to grow. Anna Lafoyiannis and Maren Ihlemann, both from EPRI, will present some of their industry-leading work in this area in today's webinar. Anna is a technical leader in the Energy Systems and Climate Analysis Group at EPRI, supporting multiple programs on resource planning. She has deep expertise and nearly 2 decades of experience in our industry with a focus on reliability, resource adequacy, and market design. At EPRI, her research focuses on long-term resource planning, risk analysis, and investment decision-making under uncertainty. Prior to joining EPRI, Anna was supervisor of the reliability assurance of Ontario ISO's group, where she developed its capacity market, set specifications on long-term contracts, and define grid services needed to ensure future reliability. Anna also held leadership roles at NERC, including the chair of NERC's Reliability Assessment Subcommittee. Maren is an engineer scientist working at EPRI and working on resource adequacy with a research focus on new methodologies and climate resilient planning. This includes innovating resource adequacy metrics, conducting thorough RA assessments, and exploring novel strategies to ensure resource adequacy in the context of climate change. Prior to joining EPRI, she completed her PhD at KU Leuven University in Belgium in the group of energy systems integration and modeling. Her research there focused on developing and applying highly flexible multi-energy system modeling tools. And as a part of the Horizon 2020 project called SPINE, she was one of the core developers of SPINE OPT and later led corresponding work package that resulted from that work. I feel very fortunate to have Anna and Maren here with us today. It's been a pleasure working with them, and I really commend them for their leadership and expertise as the primary authors of ESIG's report called Assessing the Flexibility of Green Hydrogen in Power Systems Models. This was recently published this month. This report can be found on ESIG's website at esig.energy under the Resources tab. Anna and Maren will talk today in the webinar into a deeper dive into the topics of flexibility from hydrogen. Anna and Maren will expand on what is driving the growing interest in hydrogen, what could the growth and impact of electrolytic green hydrogen mean in the power sector, assessing flexibility from hydrogen and possible participation models, and also talk about a bit about the representation of hydrogen plants. I greatly value Anna and Maren's contributions to the ESIG and the energy industry and really look forward to what they both have to say. So just a short reminder, once again, use slido.com with ESIG25 as the event code. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. It's a great pleasure to introduce Anna and Maren. Anna, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jason. And I just want to say I'm so happy to be here and talking to all of you. Jason made me sound a lot more impressive than I actually am. So thank you for that. And so I'm going to jump right in, and thank you for introducing one of my favorite topics, flexibility. And if you are here today, I assume you've probably heard some kind of hype about hydrogen. It might be excitement about the regional hubs that were announced by the DOE in America. You might be in Europe and there's advanced planning and deployment of hydrogen there. If you were like me 2 years ago, it's just that I read it in newspapers and was really curious. So wherever you are, I want this presentation to kind of follow where you are at your journey. We're going to start by talking about why there's interest, what we can learn from macroeconomic models, and then get a little bit into what it means for the power sector, because we're all power sector nerds. And then I'm going to hand it off to Maren. You know that she's an exceptional modeler. She's going to talk about how we assess flexibility in our models, possible participation models. I hope that clapping was for Maren. She deserves it. And then I'll get back in and talk about how we represent electrolysis in these models. And if you're anything like me, whenever I hear about a new technology, the first thing I ask is, what do economy-wide macroeconomic models suggest? These tell me if it's feasible or if maybe I can ignore it for a while, what the uptake might look like, and which sectors. So let's talk a little bit, starting with macroeconomic models. So we begin. If you don't know, hydrogen is simply an energy carrier. It has been used alongside other energy carriers like ammonia in industry for a very long time. So the fuel itself isn't new. What is new is the improvements to cost, the efficiency of hydrogen. The potential to use it for the power sector has become more plausible than before. And because hydrogen production can and is used by industrial processes and other end uses, that means that there's a really unique opportunity for mutual benefits and synergies for investments in hydrogen production beyond the power sector. And that's a part of it that I find really fascinating. So unlike anything else that I've modeled, if I think of a hydroelectric plant, its primary use is for the power sector. We get first dibs on it. And that might be different when we talk about hydrogen. And you see that come loud and clear when you start to look at national macroeconomic models. So these models inform the potential that hydrogen could be deployed and across numerous studies. And I've only listed 2 here, but you see this all over, that there is definitely a significant role for hydrogen in our economy. And it has an especially important role for hard to decarbonize sectors. So think of something like steel production. But how much hydrogen, what its purpose, kind of depends on the scenarios. There's a lot of uncertainties about cost and availability of supporting infrastructure. So it can get really confusing to look at these models and know exactly what that means for us. And that's really the heart of our paper, because we really wanted to get a little deeper, but like, what does that mean for us? So I'm going to go to the next slide, talk a little bit about some of the ways that hydrogen might be used. I want you to start thinking about where are those synergies, right? What could we see in those macroeconomic models and what that might mean for my territory. And from those models, you see a number of technology options for hydrogen. And so it's not just clean electricity. I kind of said this, I'm harping on it, but also you can use hydrogen directly for ammonia production, steel. I'm in Ontario, so I'm all about steel, marine shipping, aviation. So, these things, these derivatives, because hydrogen is so light, can be incredibly useful for transportation. So wherever you are, you might be seeing some more uptake on hydrogen because of these other industries and economies in your region. And these are a few diagrams kind of telling you a little bit about why there's so much hype. It's hard to go a day without reading something about hydrogen, right? And it's because the momentum is really, really strong. These sources I pulled from the IEA, from the Hydrogen Council, and no matter the source, you don't have to be super specific about the numbers, but what you see is that the number of projects has grown over the last few years and continues to grow. You'll also note that the majority of projects are located in Europe, and that means that we have a lot of lessons that we can learn for those of us in North America from Europe in terms of the deployment and how to model it. That last slide, just a caution, right? A reminder that you can produce hydrogen a whole bunch of ways. So if you're grabbing information, you can't just assume that's going to come from electrolysis, because there's a whole number of ways. And in particular, we see blue hydrogen, that's natural gas using steam methane reformation, and then attaching carbon capture. So another way of making clean hydrogen. And so just to say that, right, like right now, if you were to look at today's information, you might think that there's going to be a lot of blue hydrogen, but the deployment of electrolysis has grown. And I love the picture on the left when you start to look at that growth, more than doubling from 2019 to 2022. And I'm sure as we start to see numbers come through for 2023, 2024, and so forth, you see it grow. And you see this grow everywhere in the world. So a large amount of growth coming in North America. So it may very well surpass the growth that we've already seen in Europe. But also in Asia Pacific, in the Middle East, Latin America, we see this potential. All right, so we've got this electrolytic hydrogen. It's likely to grow. Okay, what does that mean for the power sector? One way of looking at this is to look at integrated resource plans, right? Look at how the utilities are looking at it and see what their perspectives are. And last year, I did a little study looking at 115 integrated plans across America. I wanted to know whether they've incorporated hydrogen in their plans as an option, what the benefits they might think there are. What I found is that it's very early days, right? Only 33 list hydrogen as an option in their utility planning process. That when they do, is primarily to replace coal or gas units. So vis-a-vis, you're thinking about emissions reductions. But they also acknowledge that they could be an important piece of the puzzle for a lot of grid services. And flexibility is certainly one of those, and that's listed by many, but also long duration energy storage. So think of that shifting from season to season, talking about it as a resilience or fuel diversity benefit. So in short, they want to reduce their emissions and they want to ensure they have a dispatchable resource to support system reliability. Some people call this a unicorn, but maybe it's hydrogen. One of the things that I didn't see in this review, and I always think about what the gaps are, is the nonlinearity of hydrogen to emissions reductions. And the reason I thought this was kind of curious is that a lot of these have talked about the potential to use hydrogen blending. What a cool option to use a fuel and blend it with natural gas as a transition. Like I said, that nonlinearity didn't show through. And so for a utility to get the most benefit in terms of emissions reductions, that they will need to factor this nonlinear curve into their modeling. They're likely going to find that they need to blend a significant amount of hydrogen into their gas units to get the most emissions benefits. And this might take some time. So let's talk about policy in Texas. I think that it would be really incomplete if I didn't talk about this wider environment. And I would risk downplaying the role of hydrogen in the absence of talking about policy, tax incentives, stakeholder interest. And last year, we at EPRI, John Beislein did some work looking at the IRA in the US, what it might mean in terms of hydrogen price and deployment. And you can see that it can significantly change the types of resource or types of hydrogen that is produced. It might lead to more electrolysis. Really, I take away from that realistically, we're going to have hydrogen in almost every territory. And as long as there is some hydrogen, then any power system modeler should be asking, okay, how can I make use of that in a really beneficial way? What are my synergies? And how can I make sure that I use it to the benefit of being cost effective and reliable, right? Or what we all care about. And at the same time, you're seeing that there's this potential to use hydrogen for these other markets. I talked about being from Ontario, and steel is a very, very important part of the economy that I grew up in. And this means that if I were sitting in Ontario, I'd be thinking about what's the synergistic effect that I can use? Is there benefit and locational benefits out of other sectors employing hydrogen and perhaps getting some flexibility from the hydrogen production, using it as a demand flexibility resource? And so we have to shift and understand that all of these things means that there's going to be different ways of modeling depending on your territory and how it's deployed by everybody else. So you get one last slide for me before I hand it over to Maren. She's going to dive a lot deeper, but I think this is the most exciting part. And so if you haven't already read, now ESIC has 2 reports about hydrogen, a few really, really important quotes from this, right? That get me so pumped. And most importantly, right, hydrogen can provide much needed flexibility to the system when other carbon-free resources are not available. So think of them as a peaker. Think of what they could do during dark doldrums or those reliability events that get a lot of us nervous. And as a result, it might be the key to reaching 100% net zero electricity power supply. My goodness, How exciting. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Maren to talk about how to do this.
Thanks so much, Anna. And thanks for the nice introduction. Yeah, in this section, we want to talk about some of the key takeaways from our report. But yeah, feel free to go to the ESIC website to check out the report itself. What I want to talk about in this section are what are the things you should be considering when you're modeling hydrogen? What are the types of flexibility you want to consider? What could be the role of hydrogen in the power sector? And then lastly, something that is more recent work on possible participation models for hydrogen. So beginning with the next slide, I just quickly wanted to give an overview of the types of models we're talking about in general. So in power system modeling, there are a lot of models involved, and they typically answer specific questions. So, for example, we have these large-scale pathway models that are looking into the future, are trying to get a good view of the economy at an economy-wide level, take into account, for example, hydrogen policies or tax benefits and how those may impact technology choices. And those technology choices are then typically picked up by a capacity expansion model, which would then focus on a more granular level in a smaller geographical area on how this may play out, with including more detail on a unit level. But as you can imagine, those models are rather computationally expensive. So they are typically not equipped with like a whole lot of temporal granularity and temporal detail, which is where the models to the right-hand side come in, and each of them answer different operational questions. So for example, we have the resource adequacy models, or here labeled as reliability models, which will take that build out and run it for a vast range of operating scenarios, basically just to scrutinize whether the power system that we have in place actually operates reliable. And then moving even more granular, we have production cost models, which will like take a closer look at how markets may operate, what are revenue streams, how, for example, flexibility will play out in the market frame. And then we have distribution models, which will look at distribution needs and better understand how DERs will need those distribution grids. And then lastly, power flow instability models, just to check whether our system is stable. So all of that just to say, there is a lot of models involved in this process, and depending on where you sit in the modeling chain, your assessment may have individual challenges to capture, for example, hydrogen flexibility. And then ultimately, it also will depend on what type of flexibility you want to be talking about. So on the next slide, I just quickly summarized what kind of flexibilities we were talking about in our report, which range from regulation flexibility on a second-to-second basis to balancing provisions, operating reserves, and then on the other hand of the spectrum, the seasonal energy arbitrage. So really, this will depend on what role you want to assume hydrogen will play in the power system, or what you identify for your system is going to be the role of hydrogen. And the role of hydrogen, that may actually not be so clear. Yeah, thanks, Anna. The next slide, please. What we quickly found when we were working on this report is that not everybody's necessarily speaking the same language. So some people will talk about something that we label here as an exogenous hydrogen demand, where we assume that hydrogen is produced for electrolysis, but then used elsewhere outside of the system boundaries. Whereas the opposite piece to this is also found in some studies, where we have an exogenous hydrogen supply. So assuming similarly to natural gas, that hydrogen is part of the power system and can supply, for example, fuel to thermal generators. And then lastly, to put it all together, we have the endogenous hydrogen demand, where, oops, sorry, that's still on the previous slide, yeah, where hydrogen is produced for electrolysis, stored and or transported, and then brought again back to the power system to provide power at a later point in time. So let's have a quick look at those concepts in more detail. I'll start out with the so-called, or what we call, exogenous hydrogen demand, where again, electrolytic hydrogen is produced and used elsewhere in the economy. Now, how we can realize this in our models is, for example, for simply a demand time series, or otherwise possibly a price profile to kind of incorporate price responsiveness, and then also be able to only produce hydrogen if it's economically meaningful. Often electrolysis is also talked about as a flexible load. And in this context, it would be able to provide a bunch of services, for example, downward reserve by increasing hydrogen production, or on the other hand, upward reserve by decreasing production to alleviate system stress. I will say, and this is kind of a teaser, what will come later in this presentation, is that these flexible operations will highly depend on the electrolyzer type that you have at hand. So Anna will give us a brief overview over the key electrolyzer types and what the key differences are from a technical perspective. Moving on to the exogenous hydrogen supply. I will not spend too much time on this, but basically we can think of this a whole lot like a thermal generator. So from a modeling perspective, the challenges should be rather small. It is actually found in quite a few integrated planning models. And again, a teaser to some of Anna's previous work where she reviewed integrated planning models. So feel free to reach out to her if you want to know more about that. But from a modeling perspective, the only real thing to worry about here would be how we can track hydrogen in case that we want to look at the concentration within existing infrastructure. So for example, how much do we want to blend, and then how we can make sure that that's enforced. And then bringing it all together, the endogenous hydrogen demand. So here, hydrogen is produced through electrolysis and then serves as a fuel supply for the power system later on, so endogenous. Now, this means that we'll bring all the different concepts together that we talked about prior, but also we have an additional challenge because now we need to worry about storing that hydrogen. And from a modeling perspective, this is not necessarily super easy because often models don't have a long horizon that they're looking out to. So for example, a production cost model may only have one or a couple of days look ahead. So it's really a challenge in how we want to address this going forward. And then also, if we want to, let's say, dig deeper, there are questions around how we want to represent storage, transport, and other processes. So I will bring this part of the presentation to an end with just talking about possible additional modeling considerations. Those are also discussed in the report. And I'll start out with representation of uncertainties. And we kind of split this up in two different challenges. On the one hand, we have the short-term uncertainties, so where we're looking at renewable energy resources and load profiles, and depending on the specific scenario that we're looking at, those may differ. And those will then possibly also heavily impact how efficient hydrogen can be used to provide flexibility, and it may possibly decrease or increase how much hydrogen should be invested in, electrolyzers should be invested in, I mean. And then on the other side, we have the long-term uncertainties, so seasonal uncertainties, seasonal variability. So if we are imagining hydrogen would provide that seasonal arbitrage, we need to ask ourselves, what are the possible realization scenarios that we want to look at to make sure that, at the end of the year or at the end of the season, we're also able to deliver hydrogen when we need to call upon it. There are also some things to be said about locational aspects, where it may play a role. For example, if we have an abundance of variable renewable energy sources somewhere, this will likely be a location where hydrogen may be cheaper, in which case we should be worrying about how is the hydrogen transported, and then if you want to leverage existing gas infrastructure, how can we limit the blends of hydrogen, and how we can track those molecules. And then last but not least, but possibly one of my favorite topics, modeling end-use demand, modeling multi-energy systems. So here we need to more broadly address questions around sector coupling and how we want to include those possible competing demands for hydrogen from a power system perspective. Now, typically resources don't operate in silos. They typically participate in a market, which is why we've recently picked up some work on looking at possible participation models for hydrogen resources. So this is ongoing work, but we're hoping that it will be a nice teaser for a report that we'll be publishing hopefully soon. But in general, just a quick primer on what we mean with participation models. FERC defines it as a set of tariff provisions to accommodate participants' specific physical and operational characteristics. Now, if a resource has specific requirements, for example, having an electrolyzer having specific needs, there may be a revision to those market rules to accommodate those physical and operational characteristics in order to facilitate that resource to participate in the market. And EPRI adds to this discussion by saying that we will also need to make sure that those market clearing software products, that the software itself is able to handle that. So the concepts that I will present in the next slides are just analogies to existing participation models and how they may be used to represent hydrogen resources. So I'm starting out again with looking at the exogenous demand first, and then I will later on move to the endogenous demand. So the first analogy is a flexible load participation model, which kind of makes sense as de facto the electrolyzer would be an electrical load to the system. So it's intuitive. It's, however, challenging to incorporate all the technical detail that an electrolyzer may need to incorporate, thinking about minimum up and down times, ramping limits, startup and shutdown processes. So that's a possible shortcoming or something that would need to be addressed. And the other aspect is the lack of linking constraints between flexible demand and variable renewable energy sources. Now, what I mean with that last bullet point is specific to possible tax credits and requirements that come with this. So for example, if your hydrogen is supposed to be green hydrogen, it will need to be produced from specific variable renewable energy sources. So in order to capture that in a market clearing, you would need to impose such a constraint. Moving on to the next slide, a very similar idea, but kind of the other way around. So in this case, we think of a thermal resource participation model. Now, if we think of an electrolyzer as some kind of negative conventional generators, we have a lot of technical parameters that we can just use to represent those electrolyzers, which is great, but it may be a little bit less intuitive as we're having rather an offtake than an injection. And we're running into the same issue that we also saw before with flexible demand, that we can't represent those linking constraints. If we look at the endogenous demand, on the other hand, we're thinking of hydrogen as a energy carrier. So basically a storage, which makes it, interesting to look at it from a perspective where we're assuming that it's analogous to a battery storage, which has a couple of benefits. On the one hand, we have the linking constraints between charging and variable renewable energy sources that are already in place when we're thinking about hybrid resources. So that is a benefit. We can also think of hydrogen inventory as to something conceptually similar to a state of charge. And then on the downside of this participation model would really be the technical detail. So while we have some technical detail that to represent charging and discharging, there's still other aspects that we cannot incorporate, which we may need to want to incorporate to represent, on one hand of the conversion chain, the electrolyzer, but also now on the other side, maybe a hydrogen turbine. And then lastly, to wrap up my analogies, the pumped hydro participation model, which is interesting. I mean, maybe it's not the closest analogy that people may think of, but actually we have a lot of technical detail when we're looking at pumped hydro participation models for both charging and discharging. Again, hydrogen inventory may be thought of as something similar to a water level. What the challenge here again would be that we're not readily having those linking constraints between pumping mode and variable renewable energy production ready out of the box. So those are just some thoughts that we have at the moment on participation models. We'll go in more detail on this in our report. So leaving you with the cliffhanger and passing it on to Anna to talk about electrolyzers and technical details on those.
Thank you. And I'm mindful of time, so I will be relatively quick on this because a lot of the details are in our report and there's a lot more. And most importantly, the representation and the techno-economics of hydrogen are changing so quickly that I am hesitant to give you, okay, this is the number to use because it will change tomorrow. The first thing to know, and this is from the ESIG report, is that how you represent hydrogen plants depends on what electrolysis technology you use. So there are 4 technologies listed here. You have alkaline, PEM, AEM, SOEC. So 4 different technologies, each with their own characteristics, each at varying levels of maturity. The most mature is alkaline. The second most is polymer electrolytic membrane. And so if you are modeling and looking just, what can I do in the next year or 2, you can simplify and just look at those. But if you are looking into the future, you open the door to a lot more exploration of these newer technologies. And those technologies, and I'll get to it a little later, have some significant and profound impacts for flexibility. Before I get there, always important to look at cost, and part of cost is also lifetime and replacement. So when we think about electrolysis, capital costs vary by technology type. Put simply, the more mature the technology, the lower the cost, right? No different than any other technology. So you see the same kind of trend. What is also really important is the electricity costs. So in our report, we talked a lot about this, but making sure that you have really accurate modeling of electricity costs, and you've got detail there, is very important for assessing hydrogen. When you look at something that's looking maybe longer term, you want to also consider stack lifetime, because the electrolysis system consists of a stack that would be replaced, and that is the highest cost item, your biggest ticket item for a hydrogen plant. So in terms of your capital costs, replacing that stack matters. And unsurprisingly, the more mature technologies also so far have a longer stack lifetime, or in the case of anion exchange membranes, AEMs, those we just don't know because they are less mature technologies and they have yet to be deployed at scale. But I alluded to this, that there's this almost reverse effect when we talk about flexibility. So alkaline, as mature as it is, has a very low range or operating range. And that is concerning when you're thinking about flexibility. That ability to move from 0 to 100 is really important. If that range is lower, I get less flexibility from that resource. The second thing that we always think about when we talk about flexibility is this system response, right? So how quickly I can respond. And same deal, those newer technologies are likely to have much faster response. And so I get very excited about the potential for anion exchange membranes, those ones on the far right, because they've got that wide range and really fast response, and might be a really good solution in the future should they get to scalability and the price goes down. So those are just a couple of really important things to think about. And we pulled it all together, and this comes from our summary of the report that we've published, but kind of grouped into 3 areas. And while we don't have the answers. And there's very limited comparative analysis of different modeling techniques. As we explore, there are so many different ways of thinking about hydrogen, what it could mean in your system, that synergy with other economies. What is helpful, I hope, is just a simple framework. What are the questions to ask? So my apologies for not having answers. As I said, I'm not as impressive as Jason made me sound out to be, but there's 3 ways to look at them. First is, what do I need? What is important in the power system market that I'm in? Are there grid services that are important? Am I thinking about doldrums and I want to think about long duration storage? Am I looking only next year and thinking about what this could mean? Or am I thinking about 2040? Am I looking at a policy environment that's highly decarbonized? What operating regime, that tells me, is it endogenous, exogenous? What participation model I should be thinking through? And then finally, when you look at all of those things, then you can kind of start to whittle down the electrolysis systems. So instead of seeing this, and we've given you so many options today, these questions can help you try to trim them down to have something more realistic when you're modeling. And from there, then you can look at your tools, many different tools. It's a chain, but you can start at different points to be able to assess flexibility. As Maren mentioned, one thing that's really important is looking at the supporting infrastructure, but also the dynamic between hydrogen markets, other markets, and the electricity system. The last bit is then you develop the inputs. And the inputs are changing every minute. We provided a bunch of resources in our report that you can refer to. I would encourage you to keep changing and monitoring, because hydrogen research is changing so quickly that the costs are going to be very different today than 6 months from now or 2 years from now. So with that, I think I am right at time for a little bit of Q&A, and I will open up to Jason.
Awesome. Thank you both, Anna and Maren. That was really great to hear some of the work that you've been doing, and also really how that leads into more questions that obviously need to be answered in this world where things are changing so rapidly, even if you don't consider hydrogen. But when you throw hydrogen on top, there are a lot of opportunities, but a lot of challenges, right? So let's go into the questions. We have about 18 minutes or so before we wrap up for the webinar. There's actually one very easy question to answer that was at the top. It was voted down a little bit, but the question was, will the presentation slides be shared? And as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, yes, we are going to be taking the recording and a PDF version of the slides, and that will be loaded at the eSig site, so you'll have access to that, and there'll be an email that goes out to everyone once that happens. So that was an easy question. I'm going to hand this over. The first question, this was asked about 15 minutes ago. And Anna, I think you might have touched on it in some of your latest slides here, and when you have gone through the conclusions as well. The question is, why would hydrogen be the first solution to anything where it's a 4 watts in versus a 1 watt out type process? And I think they're alluding to efficiency there. Everything else would be more efficient. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? And I think some of these questions too, we'll do our best to answer right now, and then we can follow up with anything that we need after to elaborate on the questions after the webinar, and we'll email those answers out as well. So who'd like to take that first one?
I'll take it, right? I think it's like a really good critical question, right? Hydrogen is not that efficient to use. That's a fact. If it was, we would have been using it by now. Mm-hmm. But if we look out long into the future, we start to lose options for what could be a flexible resource that is also low emitting. And in conditions where you have very limited options, so especially if we look at jurisdictions that may not allow carbon capture, then you start to see more electrolytic hydrogen get picked up by these models. But what you also see, and this is why we harp so much about other sectors, other sectors might be harder to decarbonize, right? People, that's that phrase, hard to decarbonize sectors. You think of the steel industry. So they are likely to use it despite its inefficiencies. And so if they're using it, then I might be a little less concerned about the efficiency and more just like, can I get it as a flexible load for the power sector for those few times that would be beneficial for me? And then in those like, kind of edge cases, you're less fussed about efficiency because you really do need it for reliability, and you can get a really high scarcity signal for that.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree that there's a lot of things that are happening that are looking to stabilize the grid in terms of balancing and in terms of flexibility, as you talked about, that go just beyond the metric of efficiency itself. Granted, it will cost more, but it also brings more benefit. So with that, let's move on to the next question. Oops, and there's a lot that are moving around and voting up here. So the next question is dealing with the timeframes and the characteristics of hydrogen. So seasonal hydrogen being more hydrogen produced in certain seasons versus diurnal hydrogen, where that means more hydrogen produced at certain times of the day for flexibility. What's more realistic?
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one. So my take on this, first of all, would be that if you want a diurnal energy storage, then likely you don't want hydrogen, you want batteries, because those would be more effective. So to come immediately to the answer, but I will add to that still, I would say seasonal storage is more realistic because there were more grappling to find technologies that would, let's say, fit the bill as a seasonal storage. Now, I will say that I don't think that they're completely exclusive, as in, like, I mean, not as a diurnal storage, but as a flexibility provider on the short term, because you may still be able to operate your hydrogen production flexible throughout the day, just, for example, by shifting load to throughout time zones, and still at the end of the day having the same amount of hydrogen that you wanted to produce during that day. So that would be my take on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Maren. Let's look at the next question. And it's assumptions more for cost. So assumptions for cost of infrastructure, i.e. the storage and transportation, ultimately for the delivery of hydrogen, what is the impact on the delivered cost? And the comment here is that significant hydrogen storage is not realistic on site.
Yeah, and I think this is a giant uncertainty, right? There's, I think, a high degree of confidence about the turbines and what they're going to cost. You can tell I'm Canadian, I don't call it a turbine. But what we don't know is what's the cost and how that cost is going to be recovered for infrastructure. So the short answer is saying, I don't exactly know. I don't know if anyone knows the answer to that with high degree of confidence. It would be fair to say that it would be significant. There's a lot of costs to transportation and storage, and that modeling the uncertainty and having it as a range is essential.
Great. Yeah, I think that's the best we can possibly think of now. And as you start to get more projects in the ground and look at how it's used, and then as the industry matures, that will really be an indicative of what the cost is going to do. But I totally agree, Anna. Let's go to the next question. This is actually coming from Russ Philbrick. And he asked this question early on, a little bit over a half hour ago at the earlier part of the presentation. Russ's question is, your 2050 sources showed low hydrogen and no NH3. Is this because you don't evaluate the conversion of hydrogen to other feedstock or offtake like ammonia for long-term storage? And what did you assume there?
So those were not mine. So it'd be hard for me to remember exactly all the details of their assumptions. I do think, if I recall correctly, the LCRI, EPRI one did include some volumes of ammonia, but I don't remember the exact details of those assumptions. I'll get back to you though.
Yeah.
And Russ, you know how to find me.
Sounds great. Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Russ, for the question. The next question we have here, does hydrogen have more potential as a way to decarbonize industrial processes as compared to using them as an energy source mechanism?
Yeah, I love that question. This also links a little bit to the previous ESIC report that Anna mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, where I think there's a whole lot more about decarbonization of industrial processes. So a quick teaser on that. I don't think I would be comfortable giving an answer. That would just be my personal opinion on this, I guess. But it is fair to say that a lot of people are looking at these things in isolation. People are looking either at hydrogen production to only be used in industrial processes, and other people are only looking at it from a power systems perspective, with assuming that all the hydrogen that you produce will be kept for being used in the power system later on. And this assumption of the silo, is maybe a little bit questionable. And so that will be my answer to this. I don't want to like give a yes or no answer to that, but that would be my take, just the importance of being able to capture those dynamics in models.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Maren. You know, there's another question here that's somewhat related, but how hydrogen can actually be used and deployed by system operators to meet the flexibility needs. So the question came about 23 minutes ago. Do existing ISOs support hydrogen assets for providing reserve or balancing regulation services today? And can hydrogen systems qualify for resource adequacy in areas like California, for example?
Not to my knowledge yet, because hydrogen's still new. Maren, do you know if there's any?
The only thing that I can think of, and unfortunately the name lacks me, but there is, I think, a company in Texas that is doing exactly that, like thinking of electrolyzers as flexible load, and then they can kind of like arbitrage whether they want to produce hydrogen, or if it's, let's say, cheaper to provide upward reserve by decreasing production. So if I'm not mistaken, I do have a reference to that particular concept. But that being said, it's the only one that I have in mind right now. So.
Okay, thanks, Maren. So the next question is about efficiency, and particularly round trip efficiency when converting electricity to create hydrogen. I'm assuming we're talking about green hydrogen as we've been talking all through the webinar, and then converting it back to electricity from hydrogen by presumably burning it in a turbine. Can you comment on the round trip efficiency of doing that and the impact?
Yeah, it's not great. I think that's the short of it. It varies by technology. It varies by a provider, right? It can vary by the jurisdiction that you're in. So there's no one singular number for efficiencies. They are low, right? That's the challenge with hydrogen and with SUs. But this is where, like Maren said, like looking at it as a silo, you lose a lot of the potential there. So I strongly encourage, think of hydrogen in the context of the rest of the economy. Think of hydrogen as this resource that's going to be used by others, and think through that stakeholder interest. Think about those tax incentives, because that broader context starts to make that efficiency question less pronounced, and you start to get some additional benefits.
Yeah, quick addition to that, Anna, completely agree. And then just also something that we should be mindful of when we're talking about the round trip efficiency for hydrogen. It's not like a battery where it's easy, right? You have your one component, it's all in one spot, but it's multiple components, and it will depend on your setup, how you're storing the hydrogen, how you're transporting it, how much leakage do you have? Do you want to convert it to something else in between? So there's a whole lot of things. So it's not as easy as looking at a specific type of battery and knowing exactly this is going to be the round trip efficiency.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Maren and Anna for that. One more from Russ. And thanks, Russ, for asking so many questions and actually identifying when you do. Russ asked about 20 minutes ago. I think this must have been around the transition from your part of the presentation, Maren, to Anna. It says your participation models identify a lack of linking constraints with VRES. I'm assuming, Russ, you mean renewable energy sources. Why should this be? Can either of you comment on that?
Yeah, I can comment on that, and I can add to that. So basically, what we were just presenting is existing participation models, and to the best of my knowledge, there's no participation model that would directly link variable renewable energy production and demand. So there's just this linking construct is just not in place. I think that's what I was saying. Now, do I think that this is a huge lift from a mathematical model formulation? Absolutely not. But will it require possibly your participation model per resource? Possibly. So you will need to add this constraint specific to demand and variable renewable energy sources, if that's what you want.
Great. Thanks, Maren. Anna, I think this question just popped up and got voted up quickly after your last answer. The clarifying question was, what does low mean in terms of respect to efficiency? Is it as low as 10%? Is it 25 or 50%? I think you on purpose said that there's no one number, but do you have any sense of what that is? What low really means?
Leave between 10 to 25%, about 20% efficiency round trip, round of rule of thumb. But like I said, it really depends. Are you compressing it? Are you not compressing it? That changes it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I know there's new technologies, just to add on to that, new technologies that really on the conversion side of electrolysis, that if you go high pressure, high temperature with certain capabilities of that electrolysis, that you can increase the efficiency of converting and creating hydrogen from green energy up to the maybe high 80s to 90%. But then you have to consider all of the energy that it takes to heat the water and create steam in order to do that. If you have processes that are available that are already there and are parasitic, well, that looks different than what you may have to do to actually heat the water if you otherwise would not have hot water and steam available. So those are all newer capabilities and technologies that I know are being looked at right now. But again, to your point on it, it all depends. Okay. Next question. I think we have time for maybe one more before we wrap for the day. What are the basic grid connection requirements for electrolyzers in terms of grid capabilities like rate of change of frequency, fault ride through, active power recovery after a fault, that may be relevant or required or considered by some system operators?
I think this is an area of development, right? System operators, it's challenging for them to come up with these requirements if they haven't had pilots in the area, if they haven't tested yet, and they haven't thought it through. And because this technology, like I said, it wasn't even included in IRPs up until this current planning cycle. So if it wasn't even included in planning, system operators haven't had a chance to really, do this work and to dig deep into, okay, what are the connection requirements? I think it's a really critical question. I used to work at a system operator, so I get the joy of saying, go challenge your system operators now that I don't work there anymore, to start thinking them through, because providing that certainty early can really change the way you might design your plant. And that'll be very helpful for deployment and accelerating some of this work.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. Maybe one more, and this is a clarifying question about what was considered in the modeling from Eugen Hoppy. What kind of storage did you consider in the model? Was it pressurized, liquid, LOHC, ammonia? Is that something you can quickly answer?
I can only, Anna, I'm not sure if this relates to the beginning of the, let's say, more long-term studies, For the report, we were not specific about which type of storage we're using. Also, hi, Eugen, I still remember you. Nice to see you. And we're not specific about which type of storage we're assuming there. We are saying, though, that if you want to use hydrogen to provide flexibility, that you will likely need to know what the characteristics of those are and whether they may have an impact on the flexible operation of your hydrogen resource.
Okay, awesome. And I see a whole bunch more questions just popped up. We probably have about 15 to 20 more. We're at the top of the hour and we'll look at those questions for sure. Thank you for participating and asking all the questions. So I want to thank Anna and Maren again for this really compelling presentation. And I hope you all take the time and take this call to action on this new technology seriously, as the reliability and flexibility of the bulk power system certainly can't be compromised. And looking at new avenues and metrics and mechanisms for flexibility is certainly needed, and needed urgently. As I mentioned earlier, we'll email out when these video and presentation materials are available on the eSIG website. They'll be available at esig.energy under the resources tab, and we'll get those posted as quickly as possible. We really appreciate your engagement and look forward to seeing you again soon at our next GPST eSIG co-webinar on market stability products on May 14th, or our markets and forecasting workshop in Salt Lake City in June. Further information will be about all of our webinars and meetings will be found at our website at esig.energy under the events tab, as well as in our newsletters and informal emails that you're all receiving, and you're certainly all invited to attend. Anna and Maren, thank you once again for this really great webinar, and thanks to all of you for your engagement and participation. We really look forward to seeing you again in the near future. And in the meantime, everyone, please take care, please stay safe, and thank you for your participation. See you soon.